The deliberate practice of representing the Buddha solely by means of symbols, and without any pictorial reference to a human form, during the first 3 centuries of the religion's history, is one of many observations that suggest that the famous sage of the Shakya clan was actually a god and not an historical figure. It is a matter of fact that archaeological records of India contain no human images of the Buddha until at least 300 years following the celebrated sage's supposed life on Earth. During these 3 centuries, and that's a pretty long time, the Buddha is typically represented by a constellation of traditional Aryan symbols. Symbols that originally applied to prehistoric Vedic gods and mythic themes. These symbols include, for example, a flaming or shining cosmic pillar, a chariot wheel, a triple-pronged lightning bolt, a swastika, a lotus stalk, and or a roaring lion or a group of lions, for starters. All of these token images originally applied to a number of prehistoric Aryan gods, and all of these symbols were particularly relevant to a famous plant god of the Vedic pantheon by the name of Soma Pavamana, which we cover extensively in our episodes on Vedas and Soma. Since these symbolic images are known to complement, during the early centuries of Buddhism, scriptural sources on the faith, it seems quite clear that the worship of the Buddha represents a continuation of traditional forms of spiritual expression that are obviously rooted in India's prehistoric past. The most frequently prescribed representation of the Buddha in the earliest of Buddhist texts is a vegetative element that symbolizes the sage's momentous experience of complete spiritual awakenment, known as sambodhi. Consequently, in Buddhist mythology and doctrine, a favorite symbol of the deified man was the image of a plant form, both in scriptural and iconographic sources. This plant was referred to by Pali speakers as the Mahabodhiruka, meaning the great awakened tree, or tree of awakening. So this cosmic plant represented spiritual awakenment just as much as the person that the plant symbolized. Now, it has long been assumed by most historians that the famous Bo tree, which many language specialists translate as a wisdom tree, Bo, awakenment, and wisdom being used kind of synonymously, is referential to India's massive fig trees, the peepal tree in India, under whose canopy the Buddha achieved enlightenment. When we read, however, in ancient texts, the oldest of texts, such as the biographical Buddha Charita, that the Mahabodhiruka fulfills its moral obligations by producing enlightening flowers. Or when we find in the ancient Lotus Sutra of Mahayana schools of Buddhism that the same plant was a sweet-smelling, bejeweled prop of cosmic law that sprouts to life on the Buddha's yonder shores of bliss. The botanical features and general image of a towering fig tree hardly seems appropriate. This is because fig trees never produce any visible flowers. They're teeny little flowers that are hidden within what we refer to as a fig fruit. And these flowers are essentially odorless, as is the plant. A fig tree does not have the form of a pillar, and moreover, in later iconographic portrayals of the Buddha, we find that the fig tree is often absent or not the main vegetative feature that is associated with the sage. For that would be the sacred lotus, whose brilliant flowers are constantly described as awakening with the Buddha and Brahmanic spirits in the lotus groves of paradise. And to be sure, these plants conventionally exemplify the Buddha's so-called bejeweled prop of cosmic law. So the sacred lotus is a vegetative form that best fits the descriptions, the early descriptions, and conceptual notion of the proverbial Mahabodhiruka. Modern interpretations of the Mahabodhiruka as a fig tree descends from the early impressions of 19th century Buddhologists, basically language specialists, whose initial translations of Buddhist texts in the languages of Sanskrit and Pali assume that the generic term for a plant or tree, which would be vriksha in Sanskrit or ruka in Pali, must surely refer to the prominent large fig trees that are so often observed in religious scenes among the earliest known Buddhist pilgrimage sites. The historical sanctity of fig trees in both Hindu and Buddhist traditions is undeniable, and it is the obvious source of the modern practice of cultivating fig trees within, upon, or in the vicinity of traditional Buddhist temples. And since linguists have always dominated the field of religious studies, it comes as a little surprise that they would place emphasis on a literal interpretation of the usage of the Sanskrit term for tree. Nevertheless, the employment of this same term, vriksha, in early Vedic references applies just as well to Soma Pavamana, the god, the plant god of the Vedas, a plant that is not typically considered to be woody. And in our episode on the Vedas, we identify Soma as the sacred lotus, not the fig tree. In our videos on Vedism and Hinduism, we emphasize the fact that the sacred lotus is the only plant motif of South Asia that actually symbolizes the concept of spiritual enlightenment in Aryan traditions, and that this same plant is explicitly identified as the Buddha's jewel tree of paradise in mythic and artistic traditions of India and Southeast Asia. The fig tree is never directly symbolic of the attainment of nirvana or Brahman or moksha. In both Hindu and Buddhist scriptures, it is the lotus plant that literally awakens to the morning sun with the opening of its sweet-smelling and resplendent enlightening flowers on a pillared stalk. Thus, this would be the plant that matches most closely with the early concept of the hallowed Mahabodhiruka. Now, the fig tree and sacred lotus plants have shared a very close symbolic relationship in the religious and mythic arts of ancient India since the dawn of Aryan religious traditions. At least a full millennium, 1,000 years before the birth of Buddhism, we encountered these two same plant types represented side by side among artifacts of the ancient Indus River civilization, which dates to around 4,000 years ago. This symbolic combination in the arts of a fig tree and lotus flower vanishes, however, from the archaeological record with the demise of the Indus River civilization around 3,500 years ago, only to pick up once again, as if it had never disappeared, on early reliefs of ancient Buddhist caves in eastern India around the 2nd century BC. These cave sites were occupied by pioneering Buddhist sages that practiced meditation in isolation to advance their ambitions of achieving spiritual emancipation, Mahasambodhi. Above one of these cave portals, we observe an early devotee of the Buddha. Looking above, you see geese with lotus stalks dangling from their beaks around the scene, while a lotus dragon's body frames the entire scene and is topped with a lotus trident and a mandala motif. It is not by mere coincidence that all of these symbolic elements are prehistoric and Vedic in origin. The scene reminds us of an early recommendation the Buddha made to one of his closest of disciples, Ananda by name, in a classic birth tale of one of the sage's former lives. In this narrative, the enlightened sage advises his followers to pay homage to former Buddhas by placing a Mahabodhiruka, be it, he says, quote unquote, alive or dead, within or to the side of a shrine. And then when Ananda asks his teacher if it would be appropriate to plant a seed of the wisdom tree at the gateway of his garden, the Buddha answers, "By all means do so, Ananda, and that shall be as it were an abiding place for me." So after Ananda fulfills his master's wishes, this seed that he plants is said to give birth to a full-blown, quote-unquote, Vanaspati, or Lord of the Forest, a term that is often also referenced to a reed grove or a grove of soma. It turns out that Vanaspati, one of many titles of the Buddha, is also originally a title for the Vedic plant god Soma Pavamana, as well as other Vedic sky gods that share close associations with this immortalizing plant of the gods. We observe the same lotus and fig associations among the famous 2nd century site of Amaravati in central India, where a temple column is decorated with the image of a bo tree, but per the usual, we observe both a robust fig tree as well as an awakening lotus bud and blossom at the tree's base. There should be little doubt that this 8-angled Buddhist pillar was fashioned after the image of an 8-angled Vedic yupa, or yupa stampa, a Sanskrit term used for a sacrificial stake that was employed during soma sacrifices in prehistoric times, which would be around 1,000 years before the construction of Amaravati Stupa, burial mound for the Buddha's bodily remains. The absence of Siddhartha's human image among the most ancient of Buddhist monuments, where mere footprints of the sage suffice to portray the historical presence of the man, can be attributed, at least in part, to a few early scriptural records that discourage, in fact, the use or manufacture of graven images of the transcendental sage. This prohibition recalls an analogous way in which similar Judeo-Christian injunctions were disseminated in the Ten Commandments to prohibit the same practice. Although this Asian restriction was abandoned entirely by the turn of the 1st century AD, an early text known as the Bodhivamsa states abruptly that the wisdom tree, the Bodhiruka, is the only appropriate image to portray a Buddha in art. Among the very oldest known burial grounds for Buddhist relics in central India, at Sanchi, Bharut, and Amaravati, the mythical Tree of Awakening, the Bodhiruka, is portrayed in various manners by a mixture of realistic and abstract symbolic vegetative features. One example at Sanchi, some 2,300 years ago, portrays a fig tree capped with an umbrella above its canopy, which obviously represents the mythic tree under which the lotus-seated Buddha once achieved enlightenment. This fig tree overshadows, however, an altar at the plant's base that has 3 lotus stalks, each surmounted by a trident. This symbolic form representing the Triratna of Buddhist tradition, meaning the 3 jewels or the 3 treasures, namely the Buddha himself, the Dharma, his word or doctrine, and the Sangha, the Buddhist community. And a triad of lotus stalks take their place at the base of the tree, which is precisely where the Buddha achieved enlightenment. This would suggest to me that the lotus symbols represent the Buddha instead of the fig tree, because that is where the Buddha sat himself to achieve enlightenment. Similar symbolism is observed among contemporary burial mounds at Beirut, where a trident, the symbol of the triple jewels, is supported by a lotus stalk. Now, the term Sangha, one of the three elemental constituents of the tridents, the triple jewel, refers either to a community of monastic monks that worship the Buddha, or on a mythic level, to a congregation of lotus-born devas and bodhisattvas that convene in lotus groves to hear a Buddha's sermons on the subject of Dharma, another sort of Sangha, or community. And in Buddhist tradition, in Buddhist doctrine, the Buddha's Dharma, his unassailable and eternal truth, is a second element that constitutes the tridents, another jewel. And we note here that the worshippers are bowing directly to the lotus pillar and lotus flowers that are strewn across the altar, suggesting once again that they pay reverence to the floral image of awakenment instead of the tree. Another highly stylized specimen of a Bodhiruka at Sanchi supports the same trident and parasol features, but here the tree of awakening is formed by a series of upwardly mounting stalked lotus blossoms. A radial view of a full-blown lotus blossom is observed at the plant's summit to denote the concept of bodhi, awakenment. This beaming, sun-like flower is positioned vertically with circumnavigating lotus stems around it to suggest the living image of a wheel of Brahma, which in Buddhist mythology and doctrine represents the hallowed Bodhimanda, the Buddhist Bodhimanda, Buddha's hallowed wheel of awakening. So the concept of Sambodhi, awakenment, and the concept of a Bodhiruka, tree of awakenment, are essentially consonant with the Bodhimanda, the wheel of awakenment. And they converge in this compelling image of a Buddhist world tree as mythic and doctrinal themes. That the mythic image of the fig tree tends to fade into the background and completely disappear in iconographic scenes of the Buddha following the 1st and 2nd millennia AD lends additional support for the identification of the Bo tree as a lotus plant instead of the fig tree. Similar pillars of the awakening tree are observed at Amaravati, but some compelling symbolic details are added and brought to life here by its association with various Aryan gods and goddesses. At Amaravati, the enthroned image of a burning pillar supporting a symbolic trident is used in place of a human form. So the wisdom tree is clearly indicative here of a sacred lotus. Many limestone reliefs from this famous site have lost some of their details. They've corroded, but others have not. At Sanchi, for example, the exact same pillar, but here conserving its original details, is observed on top of the northern portal to the Buddha's burial mount, this being known as a stupa. We note that 2 basal tendrils and a trident occupy the summit of this lotiformed Dharma pillar. And we are reminded in this scene of the Mahabodhiruka's description in Mahayana's scriptural sources that describe it as a sweet-smelling, bejeweled prop of cosmic law. Correct, this would be the pillar of Dharma, the lotus pillar of Dharma. And at Amaravati, once again, we observe an almost identical wisdom tree, i.e., a flaming pillar that takes its stand at the base of a prop that represents a vertically oriented lotus plant rhizome pillar, each node of which bears a pair of stylized stipules and uncoiling lateral shoots of a lotus plant. The apical medallion of the basal pillar comprises a winged floral disc that is sandwiched between an upper trident and a pair of tendrils below. The radial view of the disc reveals a radiate array of lotus petals. Thus, we are given to recognize that we are dealing with a lotus-formed cosmic tree, but here without any perceivable reference to a fig tree. This is clearly a mythical plant, as it is surrounded by divine human figures and cherubic Gandharvas, the latter creatures representing a class of Vedic deity during prehistoric times that were formerly identified as or associated with the plant god Soma in the Vedas. A clear variation on this vegetative theme is also observed on the same stupa, where the tree of awakening has a flowering trunk formed by superimposed lotus flowers, in between which we observe alternating lotiformed purnagarpas. This term meaning literally overbrimming wombs. Overbrimming, in fact, with Soma. The urns presumably contain the Buddha's so-called nectar of truth, which we must surely acknowledge as a reference to Soma, the immortalizing juices of a lotus plant. Here the plant's summit produces a pair of tendrils that culminate in full-blown lotus flowers. These serving as podiums for dancing lotus nymphs, the mythic apsaras of Vedic, Hindu, and Buddhist mythology. While these buxom lotus goddesses dance upon their floral platforms, much as they do in Hindu mythology and iconography, along with their celestial male counterparts and mythical paramours, the Gandharvas, everybody celebrates the awakening of the Buddha, the awakening of his lotus throne, and the turning of his floral wheel of Dharma. And we are reminded that this image is the prescribed symbol of a Buddha during the first centuries of Buddhist history, implying here that the awakened God is none other than an awakening sun-like flower. A pair of lions at the base of the Dharma wheel identifies the flower as the lion throne of the Shakyamuni's celebrated Mahabodhiruka. These creatures roar the truth when the Buddha mounts his pillar, or his wheel of awakening, to propound the Dharma. The image also relates to a refrain from the famous Mahayana text, the Sadharma Pundarika, the title meaning the lotus of true law, a text that actually predates the construction of Amaravati Stupa. This popular text describes the lion throne of the Buddha Amitabha as having the glistening cup of a lotus vessel, which is referred to as not as a Purnagarpa, an overbrimming womb, but as a Padmagarpa, lotus womb. For verily, this Buddha is the quote-unquote lion among kings, who, they say, roars his lion's roar in the assemblies and sets rolling the wheel of Brahma, this being referential to an assembly of lotus flowers. Since the proverbial wheel of Brahma obviously refers to lotus flowers, and the assemblies of listeners are listening intently to their enlightened Lord's sermons from their own lotus thrones, these heavenly scenes are said to occur in a celestial lotus land known as a Buddha Kshetra, meaning literally a field of awakening, where all Buddhas awaken to Dharma and extol the virtues of their abiding truth. So this field of awakening is filled with awakening trees. And would this not be the equivalent, conceptually, to the Dharma Kshetra, the field of truth, upon which Arjuna, in the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu Bible as they call it, envisions the Hindu god Brahma on his lotus throne, the field of truth. Interestingly, all of these plant motifs applied originally to a number of Aryan gods, such as Soma and the Vedic god of fire Agni, as well as the creative spirit Brahma and the Vedic storm god Indra. All Vedic gods, prehistoric gods. This is not at all that surprising, since there is abundant scriptural evidence to suggest that early Buddhist communities were aware of these associations. For example, one early Mahayanist text that was probably authored in the Punjab before the turn of the first millennium, this being the Milinda Panha, records a dialogue that took place between a Greek king by the name of Menander of Bactrian Central Asia, that would be Pakistan and Afghanistan today, and a renowned guru of his age by the name of Nagasena. This famous Buddhist adept, Nagasena, in the text, is recognized as an expert on both the three Vedas as well as the triple basket canon, the Tripitaka of the Buddhist tradition, and he was said to be a possessor of the Buddha's highest insight. So he was enlightened, presumably. And he reveals his familiarity with Vedic and Buddhist concepts of Dharma by describing the specific manner in which a Buddha presents the doctrine. I'll quote here from the translation of Hendrik Kern in the 19th century, his translation on the Milinda Panha that we find in the Sacred Books of the East collection, edited by Max Muller. And I quote, "The Buddha pointed out to his disciples the path of righteousness, which bore aloft for them the torch of truth, and set up for them the sacred pillar of truth. And with his mighty lion's voice, like Indra's thunder, but sweet, while he poured out upon them a plenteous shower, heavy with drops of mercy, and brilliant with the coruscations of the lightning flashes of his knowledge, of the nectar waters of the teachings of the nirvana of the truth, thus satisfying to the full a thirsty world." So we clearly hear in this early Buddhist passage some echoes of the Vedic Soma experience, a thirsty world, looking for nectar, the nectar of nirvana. So are we not justified, therefore, in identifying the Buddha's bow tree as the three-pointed, the Trikakub weapon of Vedic Indra, or Vedic Agni's triple-horned pillar of Vedic truth, or Vedic Soma's single-eyed, threefold pillar of the waters of life? So, typologically, a great tree of awakening is comprised of two principal elements, a column and a terminal petaled disc. And this association is also shared by the Buddhist symbol of Dharma, this being the invincible truth and doctrine of all abiding Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and Arhats in Buddhist tradition. This would be a pillar that supports a Dharma chakra, or in Pali, Dhammachakra, this being a metaphorical wheel of Dharma, which the Buddha turns as a word wheel when he sermonizes. When a Buddha preaches to the masses, he is called a chakravartin, a turner of the world wheel. Since the Buddha's chakra, as well as Vishnu's chakra, I might add, is a disc that is pictorially modeled after the distinctly flat, circular surface of a lotus seed receptacle, not only at Sanchi, but all other early historical Buddhist sites, the wheel atop the pillar of Dharma can be interpreted as an awakened lotus flower that sits upon an adamantine stalk, the prop of truth, the prop of Dharma. Thus, when an ancient text refers to a Buddha with the title of Dharmakaya, meaning literally the embodiment of kaya, of truth, dharma. Most historians have assumed the title refers to a bodily personification of truth. But in Buddhist iconography, a dharmakaya, a body of dharma, is a flowering lotus column, aka a Mahabodhiruka. So the pillared wheel of truth, as a tree of awakening, is both the support and the throne of all Buddhas, much as it was earlier the support and throne of Brahma during the late Vedic era. So the Buddha is actually a personified god of the sacred lotus, just like Soma of the Vedas. This reverses the standard perception of the close connection between the flower and the divine man, which typically interprets the flower as a symbol of an historical human, which I think we have backwards. The Buddha is, I think, an awakened human consciousness hidden within a lotus blossom. Another popular aniconic symbol of the Buddha, aniconic meaning a symbol that does not involve the human form, is a profile view of a solar chariot wheel on top of a Dharma pillar. And this image is also borrowed from prehistoric schools of Aryan religions. This is because lotus flowers, much as Soma Pavamana in the Vedas, are often likened to a single, ever-turning wheel of a solar chariot. References to this relationship are replete in Vedic scriptures that pertain to the sun god Surya, and as well the mortalizing sunlight plant of the gods known as Soma Pavamana, the two of which are said to be mutually identical to one another in many and various Vedic mantras, sun and flower. In Buddhist tradition, deer are also often associated with the chariot wheel, insofar as the first formal turning of the Brahma chakra by the Buddha during his first sermon after enlightenment took place in the famous so-called Deer Park at Sarnath. We can be sure that the stoneworkers at Sanchi were aware that the Brahmanic Brahma chakra was equivalent to the Dharma chakra of Buddhist tradition, because the lotus flower, which is both the seat and the disc of Brahma, and yet also a chariot wheel without a pillared stalk, are repeatedly identified with one another, symbolically, on reliefs at Sanchi. And at the contemporary site of Barut, which I might add provides our first examples of Buddhist imagery in India's archaeological records, we observe an alternative symbolic portrayal of the turning of the Brahma chakra, the Brahma disc. Here the lotus disc is portrayed as a rotating hub, but the hub of the wheel is a lotus flower instead of a chariot wheel, while the center of the hub remains unmoved. Ever-growing and decaying lotus stems march incessantly around the floral throne of the Buddha. The pot from which the lotus stems originate is decorated with lotus petals, a standard practice employed in Brahmanic iconography to portray a soma vessel, a vessel full of the nectar of immortality. A nearby variation on this theme portrays a linked array of superimposed flowering lotus stalks that beget one another as they encircle a lotus mandala with a disc-shaped hub. And if we reorient this circular array of flowers to form an upright linear array of blossoms, then voila, we end up with the Mahabodhiruka that we observed at Sanchi. So the Buddha, his cosmic tree, and cosmic wheel are one and the same thing. In retrospect, it becomes ever clearer that the Buddha's Bo tree is none other than the Vedic concept of the everlasting, ever-turning, and ever-burning, enlightening, sun-like pillar of Vedic cosmic law, also known as the immortalizing plant of the gods, soma. Just as the Vedic concept of dharma is associated with soma's single chariot wheel, which is said to have 3 naves, 360 spokes, and 12 fellies, such is an early portrayal of the Buddha's awakening tree and wheel, the Bodhiruka and Bodhimanda, at both Amaravati and Sanchi. In one relief, the prop is formed by a series of superimposed soma vessels, the Purnagarbhas, with a 3-membered lotus wheel at its summit. These representing the flower's seed receptacle as the central chakra, disc, a surrounding secondary array of numerous spokes representing the flower's pollen-bearing structures, the stamens, and a lotus corolla comprised of 12 petals with alternating tridentate vajra, that is, thunderbolt symbols for a felly. These 3 elements of the bodhimanda, disc and stamen and petals, are homologous to the concept of the triple world of Brahma, known as Brahmaloka, aka the sacred lotus. And indeed, many early Buddhist texts referred to the Dharma chakra as the Brahma chakra, which the Buddha turns while espousing his views on Dharma, his truth. Representations of the bo trees at Sanchi and Amaravati are also consistent with the mythic concept of Dharma in the Rig Veda, the prehistoric hymns. Dharma being, in these records, associated with a pillared solar eye of Vishnu that arises as Soma in the Aryan heavens. In the 7th hymn of the 9th mandala of the Rig Veda, the plant god Soma Pavamana flows on account of Dharma's support of truth, Rita. And in the 35th hymn of the 8th mandala of the Rig Veda, Dharma is responsible for the success and invincibility of various sun gods, including Mitra, Varuna, Surya, and the Adityas, the 7 sons of Aditi, all of whom slay underworld demons known as Rakshasas to acquire the nectar of the gods. And to reiterate, the Buddha is recognized recurrently as a relative of the Vedic Adityas, as revealed by his alternative title, Aditya Bandhu, this name meaning literally a kinsman of the sun. The Buddha has sun-like qualities, much as his tree. The Buddha's world tree, world wheel, and lotus flower are also associated with a well-known Aryan symbol known as the swastika, or walking cross. Contrary to modern impressions, which are now misunderstood in terms of a modern Germanic misappropriation of the symbol, the swastika represents immortality on 2 different levels. One relating to the continual rebirth of mortals and bodhisattvas, moving into and perpetually and out of the material world, and the other to eternal transcendence, our removal from the onward march of life, in the unmoved center of the marching cross. Mortals, like lotus flowers, come into and exit the wheel of life and its ever-turning seasons and generations on earth. So, in Buddhist doctrine, we are all samsarins, that is, transmigrating souls that enter into different forms. All participants in life's uninterrupted circular stream of suffering and material existence, known as samsara. So we're all samsarins in samsara, the flow of life. But the unmoved center of the cross represents the unchanging, ageless, and immortal state of bodhi, transcendence, which is forever above and beyond all movements in the material world, all desires in the material world, all birth and death in the material world. So the swastika is a symbol of the ancient Aryan concept of an unmoved mover, or as they would say it in Sanskrit, of one that moves and yet moves not. These coexistential realities of impermanence in the material world and permanence in the transcendental state of Mahasambodhi are embodied then simultaneously by a lotus-hubbed swastika symbol. As we discuss in our episode on Soma and the Vedas, the image of the swastika is encountered frequently on seals from the Punjab, northwest India, during the Vedic period of Indian history. Images of this symbol disappear, however, from archaeological records after the collapse of the Indus River civilization some 3,500 years ago. Like the lotus and fig tree association, the swastika reappears in northern India among Aryan tribes with the rise of Buddhism, and frequently so. And its reappearance coincides with an astounding rebirth of artistic activities in South Asia around 2,400 years ago, which coincides with basically the birth of Buddhism. As a symbol, the swastika was no less relevant to Brahmins, Hindu traditionalists, than it was to Buddhist practitioners, since both schools of religion stake claim to Aryan ancestry. And not surprisingly, when the swastika does resurface in India's archaeological records, it is intimately associated with the sacred lotus, the flower representing the unmoved hub of the walking cross, and the four legs of the motif representing four lotus stems that extend outwardly from the blossom's four quarters to pervade lotus groves with new growth and lotus-seeded jinas, i.e. world conquerors, in the lotus patch. Swastikas are often placed on a Buddha's footprint to recognize the sage as a new addition to the Aryan pantheon of unmoved movers. A Buddha's movements are accompanied by the spread of the sage's wondrous floral throne and the truth of the lotus, the Saddharma Pundarika. Traces of his footprints are all that is left of a mind that has blown itself out, achieved nirvana, so to say. The body has perished and disappeared, but the abiding truth and symbol of Buddhism, swastika, remains. The swastika has had a staying power ever since, insofar as it follows the lotus flower when and wherever Buddhist traditions have migrated to yonder shores, in a historical context. In Japan, for example, the classic Aryan symbol, the swastika, was placed prominently over a glowing flower of a 17th century world womb mandala, where it takes the place of an iconic image of the enlightened sage. The flowers may come and go, but the mind, when impacted by the flower's nectar of truth, is unmoved, adamantine, and untainted by our material deceptions, delusions. Hence, the material realm, which is impermanent, actually provides the means by which we experience transcendence, insofar as the material realm produces the lotus flowers. But when a Buddha's mind is brought together with the flower, it's blown away by the Buddha's nectar of truth. These symbolic connections are hardly original, since the Vedic creator spirit Brahma, the golden man in this sacred flower, represents a material manifestation of the flower as well, while also the transcendental source of Brahma, the God, the creator, which is the immaterial, permanent soul of the cosmos, Brahman, the source of all creation. And by the same token, the state of Brahman is equivalent to the state of Bodhi in Buddhist tradition. When the human mind is linked to the lotus of the heart, transcendence is experienced. Or this is what we hear in the pre-Buddhist Brahmanic text known as the Upanishads, which we cover in a different episode and quote repeatedly a refrain from the Upanishads. You are the one lotus flower. May I become the lotus flower among men. And this is precisely what Siddhartha Gotama did during his lifetime. Upon achieving the state of Brahman, or if you will, Mahasambodhi, a yogi abandons all perceptions and participation in life and the wheel of existence, and at that point is capable of turning the proverbial lotus wheel of transcendence, the Brahma Chakra. In the words of an old Pali text known as the Samyutta Nikaya, I quote, "The truth finder, monks, turns the Brahma wheel, saying, such is material shape, such is arising, such its passing away. From the stopping of this, that is stopped." This Buddhist passage echoes the accents of any number of Upanishadic texts. And note in this passage that early Buddhists recognized no distinction in the Dharma chakra of the Buddha and the Brahma chakra of Hindu traditionalists, because the Buddha turns a disk of Brahma, which, I might note, by tradition is invariably depicted as either a lotus flower, a solar chariot wheel, or both. The placement of the Buddha's footprints at the base of Sanchi's tree of awakening, a lotus tree of life, is another aniconic, i.e. non-human symbol of the Buddha at Sanchi. Here we observe paired footprints that signify the precise location at which an attained sage has made his last, let's say, figurative stand on earth before he ascends the proverbial wheel of awakening, the Bodhimanda, to say goodbye once and for all to the wheel of life. Ah, the paradox once again. So in essence, Siddhartha's corporeal and metaphysical being, impermanent and permanent being, is transformed at that point into a pillar of Dharma, an awakened lotus flower. Now, at Amaravati, an historical site whose name is based on the mythical home of the Soma-loving father of the Vedic pantheon, that would be Indra, is a site of perhaps the most incredibly rich collection of low-relief carvings in Buddhist tradition. And these images provide a surprisingly comprehensive window into early Buddhist symbolism. Moreover, this is one of the first archaeological sites of India that actually depicts the Buddha as an iconic figure, that is, the Buddha in the human form, the form of a famous sage. But they do so without ever abandoning his classical, aniconic, non-human images. The most substantial collections from the site are now gathered together into their own salon in the British Museum, where we observe the lasting footprints of Siddhartha's former human self embedded in the muddy mire of the sage's former lotus patch. His soles reveal the tread of a deity, a cosmic man, rather than a mortal, since they are marked indelibly with the telltale imprints of lotus-styled Dharma chakras and swastikas. Where the Buddha treads, so treads the sacred lotus. In fact, the Sanskrit term for foot, pada, also means path, implying that the Buddha's footpath leads his devotees onward toward an auspicious path to truth. But in this relief, the path leads upward, not outward, upward onto the wheel of awakening, the lotus flower, in that it's positioned just below the base of a tree of awakening. Amaravati's Dhammapada, path to truth, transects here a labyrinth of creeping lotus stems, whose prodigious flowering stalks are born from the navel of a divine entity known either as a yaksha or as a vanaspati. That would be both are aquatic underworld deities whose physical types are associated intimately with Soma, Pavamana in the Vedas, and with the god Brahma in the Upanishads. The Vanaspati, the lord of the forest that we see here, is apparently actually the lord of a lotus forest, in that he is lotus-naveled and shares this feature with various Vedic gods, including among them Soma, Agni, Vishnu, all Vanaspatis of the Vedas. We can be sure that the inhabitants of Amaravati were aware of these historical connections, because Buddhists recognize the Vedic pantheon in the realm of the gods, Brahmaloka, as their own. So the path of a Buddha leads mortals onward toward a state of everlasting bliss. This theme relating historically, actually, to various former Vedic footpaths of Soma-bearing cosmic cows in the prehistoric hymns, or the so-called honeyed step of Vishnu in the Vedas, which show the way to the nectar of the gods with no more than 3 long paces. Yet other Vedic gods also forged that same path to immortality, as would the Vedic god of fire, Agni, a very close associate of Soma, if not his symbolic alter ego, whose path lays hidden in the rivers of the Punjab, but reveals itself to the goddess of the dawn as golden pillars, this allusion referring metaphorically to the appearance of Soma stalks. Buddha's Dhammapada also seems to follow the trail of Vedic Indra, who sought the tracks of his so-called solar kine, his cosmic cows, along the banks of the Indus River while seeking out his adversaries, the aquatic dragons, with the purpose of dispossessing them, of course, of their hidden treasures, which is the elixir of immortality. So, having considered an array of related and or interchangeable symbols that signify a relatively late heroic figure in Indo-Aryan history, we can now turn to the metamorphosis of the Buddha into a full-bodied human being in Asian iconography.